It looks like it.
Yes, so
good. I never leave anything to chance, because this time it really did do us a funny one. Oh, yes, okay. Well, we are finally live. Before it gave me this ominous warning saying that I've violated some horrendous terms of service. And it wasn't live, but we are live. Hi, I'm Mitzi Szereto, and I am back with another Facebook Live event for the best new true crime stories, small towns. And I'm joined by Paul Williams in Australia. Hi, Paul.
Hello, how are you?
Not too bad, now that at least we're working. At least things are, the video's moving, so this is good. Let's cross our fingers. Yeah, let's hope we get through this interview. Anyways, I'm so pleased you could join me today. We've been communicating so many times because, you know, I've got so many books on the go, and you know, you send material in, so it's like we'll probably get you in for another book at some point. You wrote a very interesting story in the book called The Doctor, the Dentist, and the Dairyman's Daughter. Now, this is not set in Australia where you live, but it's actually set in a small town in Wales. Give us a little snapshot of this town where this story takes place.
Okay, so Carmarthen is the historic county town of West Wales. So it's just past Swansea for those who know Wales. I come from the United Kingdom. I believe I've got Welsh ancestry somewhere, but I haven't traced it to confirm. Obviously, Williams is a name that predominantly comes from Wales. I've always been fascinated by that part of the world. I love South and West Wales. I like going there. And Carmarthen has a lot of history. Obviously, it was a Roman town originally. It grew, stagnated a bit around the 19th century when the rest of Wales was expanding, but partly that was because people moved from there to the coal mines and into other jobs that created by the Industrial Revolution. And being so far down towards the bottom of Wales, Carmarthen was a little bit neglected by that. It tended to be bypassed because people would come in usually generally by sea, and they'd go up and they'd end up in Cardiff, Swansea, and the big centres of population. So it's a relatively stable town. It's changed a bit over the years, obviously, but it's a nice place to be. It's got a nice country feel about it, as well as being the administrative centre. So it's not the sort of place you'd associate with an horrific crime, but that's what happened in 1884, and that's what the story is about.
Well, you're preaching to the choir, because I happen to love Wales, and I've been there many, many times in different parts of the country, and it's one of my favorite places. So.
Oh,
yeah, I know it's not exactly rampant with crime. So
yes, I think. No, it's not. Although in the 19th century, Carmarthen, what is now Carmarthen Castle, was the town jail, and they actually had executions in there for people who'd committed murder. Before the early part of the 19th century, people had committed all kinds of what we would now see as minor crimes. But by the time of this story, it was only really murder that you would receive the death sentence for. And obviously, there weren't a lot of executions. I think there was one in Carmarthen in that year, 1884. And there was an expectation with this case that there might be another, but that didn't actually transpire as the story unfolded.
So this is, we're talking 1884. What was it like in those days in this particular town? I mean, I mean, obviously a lot of things changed as over the decades, but kind of bring us into that time frame a little bit.
Okay, so in that time period, one of the big developments in Carmarthen had been the coming of the railway, and that opened up a lot of opportunities for people to commute between other parts of Wales, and that was really the centre of the town. It gave an opportunity for people suddenly to reach those areas where previously, if you lived on the outskirts of Carmarthen, you might come into Carmarthen by road, by bus, horse-drawn carriage, whatever. But you couldn't really go much further without spending a lot of time and trying to find a place to stay. The railway meant you could go to places like Swansea and come back in the day, and you could go further afield to the rest of the UK. So it was pretty well connected. It was very centralised for the people who lived there. They didn't have far to go to work. All the businesses were in that central area, around, with the centrepiece being the railway station and the castle. So it was a relatively nice and quiet place to live. Quite a few industries around. There was a big rope works, and there was still a bit of agriculture, and they get a few fish and stuff coming through from the various ports, and there was markets there. So it was, yeah.
You know what? I just realized
nice,
something.
Quiet, stable, really.
Yeah, I just realized something. I think I've been there. I think I think the can you like walk around on like the wall around the castle?
Yes.
Then I've been there. I forgot.
Yeah, well, there's quite a few castles in Wales.
No, I know, but the name, it's
but
just,
yes,
yeah, the name is suddenly ringing some bells for me, and I guess I just forgot because I've just bounced around so many times in Wales that it's, you know,
you've been to too many places. Yes.
Yeah.
If you've been to West Wales, you would almost certainly have gone through.
Yeah, well, it would have been West Wales because I think I stayed with friends in Ruthin, which I think is not too far. Like outside Manchester. No, maybe not.
Oh man. No, that's probably not. But yeah.
Forget it. Never mind.
That's okay.
So tell us now, who are the doctor, the dentist, and the dairyman's daughter? Who are these characters?
Okay, so the doctor was Dr. John Morgan Hopkins, a very good surgeon and doctor who set up his practice in West Wales. Quite surprised me, really, because he practiced in London and in Paris, but decided to come back and live in Wales, largely because he inherited a farmhouse. Well, his wife inherited a farmhouse, let me put that way. He came to live there, but then he abandoned his wife and 7 children and went to live with somebody else. And at the time of this story, he was living by his surgery in Carmarthen, the centre of Carmarthen, at Quay Street, which is still there, or Quay Street, as it should be said, Quay, but been pronounced as K. And he had living with him his illegitimate daughter, who we haven't actually confirmed that she was his daughter, but certainly she passed as such, and she was named as such by him. Although she had the same name as one of his legitimate daughters who was still alive. So he was the doctor. The dentist was a guy called Andrew Bainton, but he used other names as well, and he abandoned his wife as well, by the way, and he ran off with somebody else, who subsequently died and was buried as his wife, though she wasn't. It's a very complex story, but goes in the heart of Victorian morality. But anyway, he was posing as a solicitor, and he met a young lady, Emily Cope, in Bath, and they had a bit of an affair, and she ended up being pregnant. So she was the dairyman's daughter, the dairyman being her father, George Cope. So the story takes off from there, that in the late stages of her pregnancy, Emily came down to Carmarthen, knocked on the door of 11 K Street one night and asked to see the doctor. Who was away at the time. He was visiting patients in Swansea. He had quite a wide practice area, and quite often he would stop overnight in one of the other towns in Wales. So his alleged daughter, Mary Jane, let this lady into the house, so she didn't know who she was. She let her share her bed and to stay there for 2 weeks. During that time, she went out to the theatre with Mary Jane Hopkins and various other people. She was seen about the time, and it was pretty obvious that she was pregnant. Sadly, she died in the house on July the 12th, 1884, having been there for 12 days. Now, when she died, Dr. Hopkins put out a story that the death was natural causes, and he tried to have the body sent back to her father in Bath. He ordered a coffin to be made, quite an expensive coffin, and he told people that no inquest was needed, that he certified the death, and it was all natural causes. But unfortunately, that wasn't accepted by the locals. Now, we have to take a step back here and think that Dr. Hopkins, whilst he was respected and was a very, very good doctor, he had a history of antagonizing people. On the farm, he was frequently in court for assaulting his neighbours, having to go at tenants, and he was a bit cantankerous. He was on the town council by the way as well, simply because of his status as a doctor. But when this story came out that a lady had died in his house, the authorities obviously got a bit interested in that. They wanted to know what had happened, and his answers were very evasive. So they decided to have an investigation. And when they did the post-mortem, they determined that Emily Cope had been pregnant and she had recently given birth to a baby. And she died from blood poisoning, which they believe was caused by childbirth. Now, Emily had written to her family in Bath saying that she had delivered a baby. I say Emily had written, somebody wrote to the family to say that. They didn't say anything about handwriting being different, so we assume that Emily, after the birth, had written those letters, which suggests that she didn't die immediately. She was in good enough health to write those letters, and also that somebody in the household, 11 Keystone, had posted those letters to Bath so that they got there. So that the authorities weren't very happy, particularly when they had the inquest, and Dr. Hopkins and his daughter and other people associated with the house all said categorically Emily Cope had not been pregnant, that they didn't know who she was, why she came there, and they couldn't explain why they let this stranger stay for 12 days in the doctor's house. It was very, very suspicious, to put it mildly. Yeah. And the investigation then asked the details of Andrew Bainton and the fact that he'd given a false name during his relationship with Emily. And so the natural suspicion was that Andrew and Dr. Hopkins had conspired to lure Emily to Carmarthen, and then they proposed to abort the pregnancy, which was a crime then, and obviously take some money. Presumably Andrew would pay Dr. Hopkins for this service, and then Emily would go back home without the stigma of an illegitimate child. So that was the theory that was probably widely accepted at the time. I would challenge some of that because my research showed that George Cope had actually lived next door to Dr. Hopkins 20 years earlier. So that suggests he knew him, or at least knew of him. And the fact that Hopkins was sending the body back to George Cope suggests there was some correspondence between them, which raised the possibility it was actually George Cope, the father of Emily, who wanted the child removed so that his daughter could come back and resume her normal life. However, it's a little bit contentious because it's so late in the pregnancy, and the fact that Emily went to the house with a box of clothes, including children's clothes, and the letters she sent suggest that she expected to have the child, then marry Andrew Bainton. Now, Bainton, of course, was already married, but he had ran off with somebody else who passed off as his wife. So legally, it would be a bit dubious, but there's no reason why he couldn't have pretended to be married to Emily and gone back to Bath as a couple if that was what he wanted to do. So we can't really say what the plan actually was. My thinking is because it was so late in the pregnancy that perhaps they did intend to have the baby quietly, and then Andrew and Emily would return as a married couple with a child. But something went wrong. In those days, childbirth was difficult, particularly if there's a complicated birth, and sadly some women did pass away during that process, so it might have been quite a natural occurrence, but we don't know what happened to the child. As we said, Emily wrote back to say that the child had been born. No body was ever found, and no one seems to have asked about the child, which is one of the things that I find extremely surprising about this whole case. No one came out and said, where is this child now? What has happened to the child? No. Dr. Hopkins, Mary Jane Hopkins, where is this child? They denied that she was pregnant. Medical evidence was conclusively against that. Emily's own word was conclusively against that. So I think there's no doubt that Emily gave birth to a child. And what happened to it? And we don't know.
That is very strange.
So yeah, and I think it also shows a lot of hypocrisy in the legal system at the time. And one of the other stories I submitted to one of your other anthologies talks a lot about that and the way that women were treated differently to men, and that within the justice system, it was very, very biased. Women weren't even welcome in court. If there was evidence of a sensitive nature, such as a birth, they would tell the women to leave the court, and only the men would be allowed to stay and hear that. And of course, women weren't on the jury. They weren't allowed to be lawyers or judges. So it was a very male-dominated system. And I think there's a bit of local politics involved as well, that with Dr. Hopkins' reputation, I think there was people on the town council who saw this as an opportunity to undermine his reputation and possibly even get rid of him, because it was a capital offence to procure an abortion. And obviously, if they had found the child, and they could prove that the child had been killed unlawfully, that would be another murder charge. So after all this was debated through the inquest jury decided that it would be a charge of murder against Dr. Hopkins and Andrew Bainton. So once that verdict was handed down, the police had to arrest both of them, and they went off to jail. Hopkins was released on bail, which you might find a bit surprising, that he was allowed to carry on practicing, and it didn't seem to have affected his trade at all. He still had his patients going in. If anything, the public hostility was more to Bainton, because he was the father of the child, and he was the cad who'd impregnated Emily and then, abandoned her, as the pub saw it. So he was very much taking the brunt of the criticism. But when it came to trial, Andrew Bainton, the charges were dropped against him because, frankly, they couldn't prove that he had any involvement whatsoever in Emily's death. All they could prove was that he met Emily when she arrived at Carmarthen Station that night, and he escorted her to the house at Key Street. There was a taxi driver who said that Emily travelled on her own, but Andrew had said that he'd taken her. So, we can take it, I think, that he did that. And then he went away. Dr. Hopkins and Mary Jane said that he never visited the house. They didn't even know who he was, which again is quite surprising, because Bainton was a dentist in Swansea. Dr. Hopkins had a practice in Swansea, and they weren't very far apart. And generally in the medical profession, being relatively small in those days, there would be meetings, there would be opportunities. They would mix in the same social circles. So you think that they would have known each other. But so when the case came up before the grand jury at Swansea Crown Court, they decided that there was no charge for Bainton to answer. Now, the grand jury, this is a question you asked in your editing, basically before cases went to trial, at the start of the assizes, when all the cases were put together, a grand jury would sift through every single case, they'd look at the evidence, and they'd say, in their opinion, if it was justified to go to a trial or not. And if they found that it wasn't, they just checked the case out, and that person never stood trial. So it was I suppose it's a bit like the Crown Prosecution Service, for those who know the English legal system now. Today, the Crown Prosecution Service will look, in those days, it would be sent to court, and then against Bainton was thrown out. The case against Hopkins went ahead, and that was thrown out too, because as soon as the judge realised that Emily Cope had died from blood poisoning caused by childbirth, he said, how can you, Hopkins, cause that? You can't, because that could have happened anywhere. Yes, he hadn't given information, he'd lied and been evasive, but that wasn't a capital crime, so he was acquitted. And there you'd think the case would end. Hopkins carried on practicing as normal. He was absolutely undeterred on the but he died in February the following year. He actually died in a pub. And when we look into his, he spent a lot of time in pubs.
Well, as far as now, the doctor and his daughter, who may not have been his daughter, it looks from what you're saying in the story, they've sort of created an abortion business, correct?
Found him in the local pub.
Oh, I was saying, according to your story,
the abortion business.
Yeah, the doctor and his daughter, who may not have been his daughter, basically started an abortion business, right?
Yes, there is evidence that Mary Jane Hopkins. Yes, there is some suggestion that Dr. Hopkins had been carrying on abortions for some years, because the thing about abortion in those days, with it being illegal, it would rarely be reported to the authorities because the woman going for the abortion was also committing the crime. So she's not going to tell anybody. The practitioner isn't going to tell anyone because it's a nice sideline. Basically, they'd exploit the woman, they'd charge them an excessive amount for that service. And often it wouldn't work. It was unregulated. There was no legislation around the safety of the patient. It was really, we've heard the term backstreet abortion, but that was what it was. It was people often with rudimentary qualifications, if any, who would basically take some money and go off and give the woman drugs, or they'd hit around them or whatever it has to be, because they didn't really want to operate, so they try and procure a miscarriage. So late stage have to operate. So there is suggestions that Dr. Hopkins was doing that, but we can't confirm that absolutely because no one has come forward to say that did happen. There were suspicions. But the interesting thing is that after her father's death, Mary Hopkins moved to Swansea, where she practiced as a midwife. She had no qualifications, and she was definitely involved in the abortion trade. The police said she'd been doing it for about 10 years in 1888, which suggests that she was practicing at the time that her father was alive, and from Carmarthen as well as Swansea. But she was eventually caught when a woman died after having an abortion at her hands and the hands of another lady. And before she died, the woman made a statement incriminating them. And subsequently, another lady came forward to say that she had also had an abortion from Mary Jane Hopkins. That the lady's statement was inadmissible because it wasn't taken in the presence of the right people, which is actually a very interesting legal point to procedure, that if they had a magistrate there and they recorded it correctly and had an independent witness, that would have been admissible in court. But as it was, it wasn't, and so without that, the case fell out. So Mary Jane Hopkins, because she had married, was sent to jail for that second abortion. Which
I have a question.
I suppose you can argue is some kind of justice if she was involved in the murder of Emily Cope, or rather the murder of Emily Cope.
One of our listeners, one of our viewers, Joe, is asking how the business was advertised. Was this through word of mouth? I mean, how did these women know that this is where you come to abort?
Okay, so some of it was word of mouth, but there would also be adverts in the papers saying something like private midwife available, or ladies seeking help, please come to me. Quite often it will say professional ladies seeking help, because obviously they are targeting ladies of a higher class who are more likely money to pay. But there's also a lack of education.
Yeah, well, the fact that it's,
and her husband wanted to. So he.
Hopefully I didn't lose you, did I?
Quite
Oh.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Oh, okay, no, go ahead. What were you saying?
I'm sorry, yes, I couldn't quite hear your questions. I was saying that Mary's husband wanted money tenants, and so he found a young lady who said she might be pregnant, didn't really know, which indicates a lack of education. So he took his hands around a bit and told her that he'd removed the pregnancy. And then he asked her to spend the night with him. So obviously she was quite annoyed by that, but that came to trial separately, and Maurice, the husband, was acquitted because there was no evidence he actually had that the lady was actually pregnant in the first place. But there was definitely a lack of education, and obviously in those days there was very little, very attitudes.
What was it? Oh, I was going to ask.
Yeah, so Mary Hopkins had got some kind of punishment, but
oh, okay. We're having a little lag here. I was going to ask you.
I'm not getting that question again. I can't hear you.
Yeah. Okay. I was going to ask you, what was it about this case that fascinated you? How did you find out about this case? Okay,
so a lot of my research into the Victorian period comes from my research into Jack the Ripper. So I've written a lot about Jack the Ripper, and my main focus at the moment is trying to identify one of his victims. And all we know about in Ireland, she lived in Wales, a colleague who died in an explosion. Then she came to London, and she drifted into the East End into prostitution. Now, the story about her time in London before she met the boyfriend has been verified to a large extent. So we know that she definitely arrived in London about 1884. We know that she lived in a place called Breeze's Hill. We know the people that she was staying with. Some fantastic research has been done by others into that. But we haven't verified anything beyond that, particularly the childhood in Wales. Now, when her death was published in the R8, John Rees was the only person in Wales who came forward and said categorically, "I'm from me and my first wife. She was our servant. She went to Swansea, drifted into prostitution, we lost touch with her." So that's a fascinating story. And when you look into it, John Carnarvon, or in that area around Carnarvon, actually from the land, it was just outside Carnarvon. But all three of their known daughters have been traced, and they were not the lady who died in London. That's categorically a fact. The three girls, we know where they were. One had moved to America. One had got married and was bearing a child still in Carmarthenshire when the other lady was living in London. And the third one also got married, and we know that she survived in later records. So it's a case of mistaken identity. But when I looked at this, I wanted to test it a bit further, and I started going to John Rees's background. I found out he was a bit of a con man, and very dodgy, for want of a better word. And I suspected that he had got involved in this abortion trade. He was a commercial traveller, which basically meant he went from place to place selling things. And I suspected he might have been a person who found patients for Dr. Hopkins and Mary Hopkins, that he'd go around and he'd talk to people who find out what was going on in the area. And if someone had a daughter or a girlfriend who was pregnant unexpectedly, Hopkins down in Carmarthen, he'll sort you out. And after a month after her father's death, Mary Jane Hopkins married John Rees. So it was only wouldn't stage your life, but that happened. And when he was tried for the abortion that wasn't, the old man has shown him how to do it. And the lawyers asked who was the old man, but the question unfortunately was thrown out because the defence said that, you know, that's not a valid question, you can't ask that, and so it was never answered. But obviously the suspicion is the old man was Dr. Hopkins, that Dr. Hopkins had given some basic training to John Rees on how abortions might be done. So yes, I found John Rees a very interesting character, and I'm still not entirely convinced that he didn't know the Whitechapel murder victim. I've got a line of research that I've come across in the last couple of weeks that I'm still pursuing. So I probably can't say too much about that now. There may be something to link in the story after all.
Well,
and interestingly, there is another link with Jack the Ripper unexpectedly, that when Mary Hopkins or Rees went to jail, she was in jail with a lady called Florence Maybrick. Now, Florence Maybrick went to jail for murdering her husband, James Maybrick, in one of the most famous Victorian murder cases. She was actually sentenced to death. The women weren't treated very fairly by the justice system, because I said, look at that evidence. She was more on trial for adultery than she was for the murder. I think there's enough there to have acquitted her. But anyway, she was in jail and she shared a cell with Mary Rees. Mary Rees made some comments in the newspapers about Florence Maybrick, about how she believed in her innocence, etc. Now, until my research, those comments weren't attributed to a particular person. We knew that someone had said this, but I'm the first person to actually identify this person as Mary Rees or Hopkins, that she was the person who made these comments about Florence Maybrick. And I also discovered that Mary Rees and John Rees had a child. I've actually got a photograph of that lady in later life, which was kindly provided by the family. But it looks like jail. The fact the child was adopted and raised by other people, but it looks like in the later sentences before Mary's death that she was actually reunited with her daughter. So that was a good outcome for the family, I think. But there's a lot of children in this story who are abandoned. You've got Emily Coates' child that died. You've got other children, John Rees and Mary Rees' daughter. Yeah. Is that your question?
No, yeah, I was just saying that's just quite a story, and so complex, with so many arms going out in different directions.
Yes, absolutely. A lot of characters involved, and obviously different angles to it as well. And when you look at the case, you can still in different ways. Was the instigator? You can argue that John Rees was involved. You can argue that Andrew Baton was involved, that Emily's father was involved, but we don't really know what the intention was. And as I said, my issue or question is what happened to the child. I think that's really where the focus should have been on trying to say what child born, was it did it die naturally during the childbirth process, or was it then killed in that house?
I guess we'll never know the answer to that.
No, unfortunately not. There's no way of telling at this stage.
Yeah. Just to move on,
there's a lot of speculation, but that's all we can do is speculate. from the facts available to us.
Yeah, yeah. Well, to everyone listening, this is the story is called "The Doctor, the Dentist, and the Dairyman's Daughter," and it's a fascinating historical piece from Wales in the late 1800s. So definitely worth a read.
Yes, definitely. Second.
Just to mention, I was going to ask you about anything you're working on. You did mention this other Ripper lead, but you're also going to be in my next book coming out this summer, The Best New True Crime Stories, Well-Mannered Crooks, Rogues, and Criminals. So you have a piece that will be in there for everyone who would like to pre-order the copy. It's available for pre-order. But what else are you working on right now that you could tell us about?
I'm excited about that one. That's okay, I'm working on a full-length book about Jack the Ripper's victim, Mary Jane Kelly, trying to identify her, which is a massive piece of research and very, very complex. What I'm basically doing is I'm going through every date that has been suggested and saying trying to trace them. And you can imagine with someone called Kelly, who allegedly married a man named Davis, is pretty hard to trace, given the lack of records. But we have confirmed that there was not a legal marriage in Wales in that time between one called Kelly and Davis. I've actually traced everyone called Mary Kelly who got married in Wales in that period. And there's only one that I'm uncertain of at this stage, but I'm pretty confident that they've all been accounted for. So that means that part of her story was false, or that she wasn't legally married, or that her husband, she had a different name, which is, so it's very, very difficult because of those common names. But I do believe that she can be traced because she would have been born somewhere. It's not like Jack the Ripper himself, where if there's no one to say who it was, then you can't prove a case. But in this case, we know roughly how old this lady was, so we know roughly when she was born. We know the information that she gave to her boyfriend. We've verified some information for her time in London, which to me makes it unlikely that she made the rest of it completely up. Or that he got it wrong from memory. So to me, there'll be some truth in that story. It's just a question of finding someone who we can confidently say meets enough elements of that story to be properly identified.
Well, it sounds like you have quite a...
So that was hoping to finish by March. That made me put back a bit.
And we were speaking before we went live about your other work that you do, and you mentioned that you're doing quite a bit of traveling around the country to Aboriginal communities. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I think people would find that interesting. I do.
Well, I work for an airline called Skytrans, who fly around Cape York and the Torres Straits. So for those who don't know Australia, it's the top end of Queensland is Cape York. So some very remote inland communities. And the Torres Straits is some islands off the top of Australia going towards Papua New Guinea. So we fly to connect those to the mainland. So we spend a bit of time working with the communities, understanding their needs, and trying to make sure that the air service is satisfactory and can get them in and out. At the moment, in wet season in this part of Queensland, some of the inland communities are not accessible by road. So that means our flights are the only way of getting people in and out of those communities. So you've got health workation, you've got people coming out for surgery or for emergencies, and you've also got transporting the groceries and any other goods that they need up there. So it's challenging, but quite rewarding.
Wow, that's yeah. I mean, remote. I think a lot of people don't really understand remote until they get to that kind of a place.
Yeah, we get people in England who think they can drive around Australia in a day. And I have to say to them that I'm in Cairns, my family are in just north of Brisbane. That's a 19-hour drive. And obviously, if you're driving on your own, you stop over a couple of times because you wouldn't want to keep driving that length of time. And at night, with all the wildlife on the roads, you probably don't want to drive in the dark. So it's vast areas. A lot of people don't understand that. They don't appreciate that some of these places they are a good distance from the nearest community. And so getting goods in and out is just as important as
I
getting
imagine
people in
it's
and out.
even more of a challenge now with COVID and all these things going on.
Yeah, we had a lot of issues with COVID last year because the priority is to stop the infection getting into those communities, because obviously they're tight-knit small communities. If one person gets diagnosed, a lot of elderly people there as well. So if one person got it, because there's only like one shop in a lot of these places as well, so the chances of them mixing is high, and the chances of there being a big outbreak is high. So a lot of work was done to stop people getting in there. In fact, when I first came to Skytrans, we weren't flying out of Cairns Airport. We were flying out of our hangar at the side of the airport, simply to keep the passengers going to those places away from the general public in Cairns Airport. So a lot of precautions were taken, and we were obviously in contact regularly with the authorities, both at a federal level and at a local level, to understand what was going on. And if we'd been asked not to fly there, we would obviously have suspended services. But fortunately, we were able to provide a service through that period and beyond.
Wow.
I think in general, Australia has been, and some people might disagree, I think Australia's not been as affected by COVID as other parts of the world. I think we've been quite fortunate in that respect. Yes, there's a personal impact for people like myself who are now working far away from the family, but in terms of the deaths and the number of cases, we're nowhere near as bad as America and England and other parts of the world. So I think we're fortunate there. In a way, it's because we're isolated, because there's no land barriers and it's quite a way by sea or air. But yes, it's good for us that we haven't had that level of
well, cross fingers
infection.
it stays that way, and I wish everyone would follow suit, but we have a lot of people that need to take some medication to kind of have sanity be restored. They're not taking it very seriously.
Well, there's a sense of complacency here. I mean, for example, you're supposed to wear face masks in an airport, but the airports aren't all policing that, and the police aren't interested either. So it's a little bit, if you're on a flight, you have to wear it. So if someone tries to board a flight without a mask, they can be denied boarding. But in the airport terminal, we're supposed to get the mask on as well. A lot of people just don't.
Maybe if the rate goes up, they'll start being a bit more vigilant. Although that hasn't happened in the United States, sadly.
Yeah, I take the view that people are just a bit selfish, because unless it happens to them or to someone in the family, they don't really seem to care as much. And it's not that inconvenient to take precautions like wearing a mask. And if you have to have a lockdown now and again for a few days, then if that's keeping everybody safe, ultimately, I think it should be done. I think you've got to look after the common good, and you've got to do what you can to stop this spreading.
Well, let's hope at some point, maybe the next time we talk, things will be much improved. But let's cross fingers again for that.
Let's hope so. Yes.
Well, I've been speaking.
Yes.
I've been speaking with Paul Williams, who is a contributor in the Best New True Crime Stories, Small Towns. And there's some great stories in here, including Paul's story, "The Doctor, the Dentist, and the Dairyman's Daughter." Thanks so much for joining me, Paul. And you be really safe over there with your flying around and everything else.
Yes, let's hope it stays that way. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.